Good afternoon. Welcome everyone to course level assessment of student learning, what research tells us about the do's and don'ts. I'm Julia Michaels, Director of Development Strategic Partnerships for UERU. We're continuing on with our assessment theme this spring. We had wonderful town halls back in March on teaching evaluation reform and grading system reform, and now we are turning to the question of how to assess student learning outcomes at the course level. Just a quick reminder, everyone's muted, but we will have ample time for discussion during which you can raise your hand and ask to be unmuted to speak. But in the meantime, please feel free to post questions or contributions to the chat throughout today's event. Without further ado, I'll turn it over to Archie Holmes, Executive Vice Chancellor for Academic Affairs at the University of Texas System, to get us started.
Thank you very much, Julia. So before I begin, I really want to thank Jillian and Kate from Harvard and MIT, respectively, for joining me for our first event on grading reform. If you were not able to attend that event, the My UERU site has a link to the recording. We'll also drop something in the chat for you all. But for today, we want to set grades aside for a moment and focus, as Julian said, on student learning. Specifically, how do we as educators design environments in which learning can truly flourish for all of our students? For me, at the heart of this is the creation of activities in which students engage either on their own or with a team to acquire new knowledge or skills and to apply what they already know to meaningful tasks. They can't do that without the critical role that feedback plays and how we provide students with clear information about how they're doing and what they can do to continue developing their knowledge and skills. And I probably don't need to tell this audience this, but a grade on its own is a really poor way of providing this type of feedback. In a future session, we'll take a deeper dive into what the research literature tells us about grades, but as a quick preview, it's not all that positive. So today, our focus is on assessment. With that, I'm delighted to turn things over to my colleague and co-conspirator on these sets of town halls, Michael Denon, who serves as the Vice Provost for Teaching and Learning and the Dean of the Division of Undergraduate Education at UC Irvine, who will introduce our panelist, our moderator, and the rest of the session. So Michael, on to you.
Great. Thanks, Archie. First of all, it's been really fun with Archie and I being co-conspirators finally out in public working on this, which is exciting. Many of you have known us for a while in doing this. And it's very exciting to have this panel where we focus on assessment as laying some groundwork for this bigger question we asked back at the national meeting is how do we communicate, who do we communicate, what students are learning in the audiences. And we've identified the student as an audience, right? The outside world is an audience. And so this is perhaps a little more about assessing and communicating to the student, but ultimately also then communicating to the outside world what they've learned. And so our panelists today, their bios and exciting their exciting titles are in the chat. You can look for that there. But we've got Linda Adler-Kassner here, Richard Arum, and Tim McKay. And I'm going to turn it over to our moderator, Josipa Roska, to just get us started.
Great. Thank you, Michael. It's a pleasure to be here today and to start the conversation about assessment, focusing on courses to begin with. We'll broaden it later. But if we think about course level assessments, particularly summative course level assessments, can you think of an example of something that you thought was really effective assessment? What was it and what would make it effective? So Linda, you want to get us started?
Yeah, I'll get us started. Absolutely. So a productive summative level assessment is one that enables students and the people who are working with students to identify what they have learned through the course of a period of time that's focused on learning. So in my discipline, composition and rhetoric, writing studies, we have a long tradition of using portfolio-based assessments, which enable students to demonstrate how they've learned the concepts and skills, ways of thinking and practicing they've been developing in courses over time. Also joining that with metacognitive reflection on their learning. Now, people might say, well, you can do that because in writing, you have that ability to collect written evidence. But there's lots and lots of research showing how this can be done across a number of disciplines. Lots of this work, in fact, has happened at University of Michigan, and maybe Tim wants to address some of that. Through things like their MWrite platform, we know that it can be really effective to incorporate formative assessments that build to these summative assessments that, again, focus on critical concepts and ways of thinking and practicing with metacognitive reflection and application of learning in ways that are efficient enough to grade even in large courses.
Yeah, I can jump in here, Josipa, a little bit. What I would add is that let's think about what the word summative means. It's summing up. It's a total, a demonstration of the sum. So you can have a final paper at the end or some final task at the end that sums up everything and serves as an assessment of the total. But you can also sum up the individual work that has been completed over the term, and that's a summative assessment. And I think that's aligns very well with what Linda started with, the portfolio approach, which is basically compiling all the things that were done or the most meaningful ones, and that serves as a summative assessment.
Yeah, I agree completely with that. I've always found the distinction between the two somewhat false. Good assessments contribute to a learning process that really never ends, right? And so the best assessments are the kinds of things that, first of all, they provoke deep, engaged learning experiences for students, and then they leave evidence of what has happened, of their state of development in some kind of way. And so even when they're nominally summative, I think the goal is for assessments like this to provide students with an improved sense of where they stand and also to inspire the next stages in the learning process. So I really want an assessment to leave a student feeling hungry for more in a way, rather than finished and putting that away and I'm never going to look at that again. Right? So, in a lot of big courses, high stakes exams are used and they're kind of meant to do something summative like that. They're meant to provoke learning, but I think they generally fail. The engagement or learning that they provoke is kind of shallow often. It's often last minute, and the evidence that they provide is often thin, sometimes even illusory of what student knowledge really is. So I guess I would say my favorite summative assessments provide students with a chance to contribute in some kind of reasonably autonomous way to deciding what they're going to do to demonstrate their knowledge. So they have the ability to contribute in some sense creatively to it. They can focus on topics of real relevance to them. They can try to advance skills that they're really interested in advancing. And that give them a chance to kind of fluidly demonstrate their competence, right?
Can I jump in and say, so I like
please.
Tim used the word provoke the behavior you want to see. I would use the word incentivize. I hang out a little bit too much with economists in my day job, but the more you can structure the assessments to incentivize the behavior you think is aligned with the learning outcomes you want for the course, the more it's a win for everyone.
Absolutely.
And I'll just jump in to take one step even further back from that, and that is designing for this. Yeah. I think so often we approach a course thinking, this is what students have to learn, rather than thinking, what's really important for students to learn, and how do I design for that to happen?
And what do we want them to do? Because the doing part is where the learning happens.
Right.
So getting the doing to happen one way or another.
And Tim, to your point about doing and earlier, I think the authentic assessments, right, portfolios, projects, things that students are actually engaging in are things that people are talking a lot about as ways to really both incentivize and assess what students are learning. But how do you think about that in a large, multi-section course that we all have in our institutions?
Yeah, I think about it a lot, and I think it is practical in different ways from what people expect. One constraint that I think people have to be freed from is a sensibility that they are quite focused on exact uniformity. The goal is for all students to learn the same thing, and then on something like ranking. Right. So if you think the course is really just one thing and everybody has to do exactly the same things, and that my goal at the end is to be able to put them on a unidimensional scale on that one set of things, then that will push you away from taking advantage of the opportunities that like student autonomy can provide. If students are able to develop skills in an area by focusing on things they're most excited about, and those are not all the same for all the students. They don't learn the same things. That's okay. It doesn't happen even when you insist they learn the same things, right? So taking advantage of that allows students to play a bigger role in shaping and designing and delivering the product of what you're hoping to see. And that fact that students play a big role in it helps it to work on larger scales too.
I want to add to something that Tim's brought up there, and that is this idea of autonomy and agency. Even in really large courses, I think oftentimes I've heard faculty say, there's nothing I can do. Students have to learn these things in this course, and there's no way to build in anything else. But when we think about, what is it that we're designing for? Why? What do students need to learn? Why do they need to learn those things? And you present, here's the 8, 9, 10 really key concepts, ways of thinking and practicing, skills, knowledge people need to come away with. But then you say, for example, at the end of a course in a summative assessment, I want you to take a deep dive into 2 of these things, 3 of these things. That's a really good example, as Tim's pointed out, of a way that students can exercise autonomy and agency in a context that's more authentic for them, even in a course that has multiple sections that's very large.
I would just add that if all you're doing is sorting students at the end based on the performance in around a test or something similar to that, we know that's going to be so correlated with the starting point where the test you would give them the first day of class. And what isn't correlated would be around their engagement, right? Which Josipa and I called it time on task, like other drawing on the literature in our work. You could also think of engagement being cognitive, affective, behavioral. But if that's the added benefit of the course, the learning, measure that. Don't just measure what the starting point and the correlate, because it's going to be so correlated with their sorted differences at the start of the class. That's not learning, that's something else you're measuring.
Yep.
Yeah, and Richard, I want to follow up on that, the idea, right, that lots of summative assessments basically reproduce inequality or assess inequality. They assess what students come in with. But so, Linda, maybe you can help us think about, so how would we design assessments in a way that do not correlate with, what students bring in to us, to higher ed?
Yeah. And I do want to reinforce the point you just made, Josipa. I mean, it may correlate with what they bring in, but we all know we can track that right back to, family median income, all those kinds of previous experience, all those things. So one of the things, the idea of, again, what is really important for students to know, do, practice, take away from this instance? Where can they exercise autonomy and agency around that? And then how do we design for that? Well, one way we can design for that is by sort of surrendering our attachment to having everyone do everything at exactly the same time in exactly the same way, and shift to what now tends to be called a competency-based learning model, but has been called lots of things because it's very it's come up over and over again. So when a course becomes, you need to master these kinds of things before you can move on to the next level, we can call that competency-based mastery right now, then students are practicing with those things in their own way. And then we can build in different ways to support students as they encounter challenges with things that they feel are more difficult, where they experience learning bottlenecks, et cetera. Those things can be people, different kinds of people, undergraduate learning assistants, near peers. They can be even, for God forbid, sometimes maybe even AI assistants, who knows? But different kinds of assistance to help people get the things that they need that will help them learn the things that are important, autonomy and agency, that they can then demonstrate in a summative portfolio. And when they reflect on that process, that is really what we know correlates with the ability to move that learning to other locations. So at the undergraduate level, especially, putting aside introductory STEM courses, I mean, there's always procedural knowledge that students are going to need to take away from any course. But what we really want to see is people's ability to be flexible and apply these concepts to different situations in different kinds of ways. That's what matters. And that's what the idea of different modes of transfer research has told us happen as people reflect on how their knowledge gets put together. That's how expertise is formed. So that's what I would say.
Great. And we're talking about assessment, right? We're talking about how do we do this really well and how do we capture it. But Richard, I want to go back to the question of, but can you really change assessment without changing teaching, right? Is really the teaching the first part of needing to change before we can change assessment, or can assessment drive changes in teaching? How do you think about that?
Yeah, I would say ideally both. Ideally both. Ideally, assessment tells us something about what's working and what's not working, and could stimulate revision in our pedagogy. But I think I was going to take a step back. We're focused a lot on assessment, and of course, I know all the panelists are going to agree. You have to start with learning outcomes, right? Like, if you're focused on how do you get assessment right, but it's not connected to what the learning outcomes are, and thinking about the learning outcomes, it's not going to be aligned with kind of helping inform and improve and stimulating change in teaching. It's not going to be aligned with measuring what students have done in the course. It's going to be giving you a measure of something else. And so, what exactly are the learning outcomes? I love that Linda hit on concepts. I love that she talked about competencies, like Josip and I, in our earlier work in measuring college learning. We work with 9 different disciplines, promoting disciplinary-based concepts, disciplinary-based competencies as key learning outcomes to design around. So again, yes, it can inform teaching. Yes, it can be connected to teaching, but I guess the learning outcome piece is the necessary ingredient for that alignment to occur.
Yeah. And maybe I have an anecdote that contributes to that conversation you just raised about how assessment can inform teaching and the relation to learning outcomes. So introductory physics courses, which I've taught many, many times, have as a general set of goals that physicists would speak about. We want people to learn to think like a physicist, to understand concepts and be able to speak about them in a way that is related to what an expert might. So we engaged in a pretty extensive study of whether that was happening with students in one of our introductory physics course that used our traditional assessments and some very different assessments altogether to let us see what was really happening. The topic is what's called potential energy, a beautiful, very abstract concept that is usually tested by asking students to solve puzzles on multiple choice questions that involve the manipulation of equations. They may not know what those equations mean. They may not know what the symbols mean, even in those equations, but they can do the puzzles and come up with answers. And so 80% of them would get this question right, and we would think, oh, they understand potential energy. Then we engaged in this MWrite project that provides very rich writing prompts for students to engage in writing to learn activities around potential energy. And we did this for 800 students in the class, and what we found is that they have no idea what potential energy is at all. And it really undermined our sense that what we were doing in the class had any efficacy toward the real learning goal that we had, right? And until we had engaged in a different form of assessment, even if that form of assessment wasn't really part of the system that builds the grade yet, we were really learning something that really transformed the way we think about that teaching. So that's another thing we should consider, is that there can be forms of assessment very valuable that aren't really built into the grade system, or not yet. or might never be, right? They're just part of the real assessment system, not just the grade system.
Well, and Tim asking that makes me wonder about feedback to students, right? Because sometimes grade is I guess, some form of feedback, right? And students respond to it. But what would you say are kind of good ways of providing feedback to students at a course level that also recognizes the fact that, we might have a large class with 100, 200, 300
Yeah,
students.
yeah. I mean, and maybe an example like that is a good one, where we have asked students to engage in a writing exercise to explain how they would explain a phenomenon like potential energy to others. And then we have a conversation about what constitutes really rich and effective answers with a variety of examples for students. So every student knows what they wrote, and they're looking at the examples that we present to them and weighing for themselves what they wrote against those examples. And that way provides a kind of way for them to see a variety of variously effective examples and get the feedback. But it's kind of partly self-formed, right? They have to do some of this comparison themselves. If we foster that in a classroom environment, we can help make it happen, and it can still happen for lots of people.
We've run a similar initiative here at UCSB for many years out of my office that we call Access to Practice, or ATP. So using a peer review platform that was originally developed in Michigan State by a couple of my colleagues called Eli Review. But we work with faculty to develop highly structured writing prompts and highly structured peer review activities. And the platform is super, super flexible in that way, has lots of different options. And it's the same thing. It's been used in classes of students. Some of our largest classes tend to be around 800. So it's been used in classes of 800. Instructors tend to provide what we call a whiff of credit for students to complete these writing and then peer review activities, so they get feedback from each other, because we do research on the initiatives that we create and promote in my office. We know, unsurprisingly, Susan Marie has just put it in the chat. Thank you, Susan Marie. We know, unsurprisingly, that when students complete at least 2 of these writing and peer review prompts, they do better on summative assessments, and controlling for all the factors that we're really concerned about here in California, where we can still very much work with disaggregated data and are very much concerned about the performance of different populations of students. So I always say, if it didn't work, they'd have to take my writing teacher credentials away from me, because the idea that writing helps people learn is such a foundational concept, but it can be done in very accessible ways, with lots of students, without putting a huge burden on instructors or TAs or whoever's doing grading. Thanks to these really smart platforms. Calibrated peer review is another example. I mean, there's a number of these, but yeah.
I was going to say one thing. If it's going to be meaningful for students in terms of feedback, one thing you're going to need to do is provide subscales, like a rubric where people see what their strengths are, what their weaknesses are, or subscales on a test. You're good at, you've done well in this, but you need to develop this competency. If at the end of the day it's just a number or a grade, it's worse than being not useful. It's misleading, and this is why. Because the different disciplines in the universities have different grading standards, the students will get grades in different areas that aren't comparable. And so they will mistakenly assume that they are better at discipline A than they are at discipline B, because they don't know that discipline A, everyone gets an A, and discipline B is grading on a different, in a different framework. And so you're misleading the students to make poor judgments that might have consequences for their trajectories and outcomes. And so again, it's not that this just lacks information in terms of feedback. the information could be misleading.
Yeah, that's very true. We've had some really interesting conversations with students recently about internal grading practices within courses that are that use high stakes exams and that regularly give exams that have quite low median scores. The instructors of these courses are often familiar with this approach. They think it has advantages, that it allows them to better challenge different kinds of students. What they seem to have missed is the kind of very strong affective impact that it has on students. If you are a good student, which the median student in every one of these classes is, and you can't even answer half the questions on the test, you are left with a sense that you have learned no more than half of what you were expected to learn. That's not what the instructor is thinking when they do this, but it has that very powerful affective impact on students. You know, your point about reduction of understanding to numbers is one of the most profound challenges we face, I think. If students were instead thinking, how well can I explain what I know in this subject and in this subject and in this subject? If someone sat down and talked with them, they would have a much better ability to assess where they really are, I think, in their learning. And so the more we can get to exposed thinking in the form of language, the more we're really going to be close to having them be able to assess themselves.
And I think there are many ways, you know, I don't want to sound like a technology evangelist, but there are many ways that we can use technologies to do these kinds of activities, such as these peer review platforms, such as, you know, using, you know, even having students do talk alouds through their work and having those be, you know, sort of assessed or evaluated, that looked at by peers or by, you know, in groups. There's all kinds of strategies that we can use for this that are pretty accessible. But we need to design for them. And we really need to think about what it is that we want students to take away from these courses. Had a conversation recently with a colleague here who's teaching a course where students are expected to, you know, they're given an exam where if they divided their time evenly on each question, they would spend 2 minutes per question in a high-stakes testing situation, answering those questions. And what is that testing? What is that designing for?
Great question. And you just got me started on the next topic, which is really about technology and AI, right? So, I mean, faculty for a long time, they've had questions about authenticity of student work, right? With Chegg and everything else, right? How can we trust that this is really student work? But AI has kind of put this in a whole new dimension and raised all kinds of questions about it. And so how should institutions really think about supporting faculty in this new environment in which AI is pervasive? Linda and Richard, you want to kick us off?
Oh, you want to start, Richard? You go.
Well, first of all, we should start with, this is a moment for intellectual humility, right? This is a new technology that's changing much of how we teach, learn, work. It's developing at an extraordinary pace, and so all of our ways of thinking about it should be tentative and open to iteration and development. So I want to start there. The other kind of comment I would make is that I would start not with the assessment problem, but with the learning outcome challenge. As the tools develop, how do we think about learning outcomes? What students need to know? What are the competencies we need to develop in them to be effective citizens and workers in the 21st century? And I think it brings us back to a lot of these kind of, again, just what we call generic higher order competencies, like critical thinking, like problem solving, like writing. I'm going to come back to writing in a second because that's where the core of a lot of this AI stuff is. but also some of these durable soft skills, right? Collaboration, communication. So we need to really to double down on the conversation of what are we trying to develop in the students to be effective as these new tools come online. So then going back, last comment on writing. Well, Lyndon knows this. I was an old English high school teacher before I became a sociologist. And I remember back from those days, writing is a process, right? You teach writing as a process. You don't just give students an assignment and say, come with a 20-page paper at the end and I'm going to evaluate it. You teach them how to develop different parts of it, theses, topic sentences, logic of use of evidence. You teach about these different components, and you teach about the importance of getting feedback on it and revisions. Go back to that kind of what are the core competencies involved in writing, and maybe AI can be harnessed and used for some of those to support that process. And so it's not that writing is no longer important and we don't want to teach writing, but we have to kind of be open, just the way math instructors hopefully were, not always, but to use of calculators. And so it doesn't mean you don't teach the fundamentals of math, but you also teach people how to, once they understand what they're trying to do in math, it's sometimes appropriate to use calculators. I do it. I use calculators and computers in most of my quantitative calculations because I understand the basic principles of math. So I don't know, Linda, what?
Sure. I mean, I'll say a little bit about writing and more about AI. So when we think about it, since people often think about AI and writing, writing is a subject of study. And when we approach writing as a subject of study, something that in the same way that physics is a subject of study or sociology is a subject of study, it means there are things to learn and things to do with that. So when we think about writing as something that is studied and then developed in particular contexts, because characteristics of good writing are context specific, there is no one generic good writing upon which all other kinds of writing are based, then we can think about where may or may not AI be useful as we engage in writing. Writing is, especially in academic disciplines, tends to be very generic, that it has relatively common features within disciplines. And so, faculty, of course, can make the decision about to what extent they want to allow students to engage with AI, to study and enact these generic choices within disciplines. Sources are integrated in particular ways in sociology that are different than in physics, that are different than in writing studies. Do you want to have students use AI to do those things? Maybe. I could go off on a long tangent about the kinds of writing we have people do in courses, but I won't. I'll come back instead to this question of AI and how do we engage with it. And I really appreciate Rich's point about humility, absolutely. And of course, lightning change. I mean, this isn't the first time we've seen, technological disruption. The beginning part of the 19th, 20th century was the same, but it's moving at, a bazillion times faster than it did then. And so I think to say that we've, cracked the code, solved the problem, anything else is no way. We're like holding on to one of the rocket ships that went off at Vandenberg Air Force Base last night near my house. It's moving really quickly, but we certainly can create conditions for people to study and engage with AI. I mean, we're doing that. And so we've got a lot of really interesting teaching and learning with AI projects going on here at UC Santa Barbara that our colleagues, apply for a little bit of money. They develop these projects. We work with them to do it. They see what's happening. And people are doing things, developing course chatbots, which is a pretty accessible idea. Thinking about maybe how could it help with feedback, certainly helping with reflective processes, those kinds of things. Yesterday, I was skimming through a new book by Alexander Sidorkin. Maybe some of you have read it, AI Enhanced Pedagogies. It's very provocative and I think really interesting. If I'm going to try to summarize the introduction to the book, in which the author, and somebody can correct me if I'm getting this wrong, suggests that in developing learning along these sort of scaffolded procedures, we've missed the boat on what research tells us about expertise. And so we really need to rethink that as we engage with AI. And, you know, he says, assessment shifts from measuring what students know, I excerpted this, from what students know to evaluating how effectively they identify what they need to learn and how strategically they pursue such learning. Students demonstrate competence, not standardized performance, but through evidence of growing sophistication in learning how to learn within their chosen areas of complexity. And I think that's a really interesting and provocative way for us to think about designing for using AI. And this book does offer suggestions about how to use AI in learning. It's very exciting. Yeah.
Yeah, I think this is a gigantic topic, completely undetermined at this point, but evolving fast at the same time. One thing it has done in the natural sciences, particularly in sort of traditional large introductory courses, is break the connection between process and product. So we have long done things like asked students to complete homework sets, because it was the case at one point in the past that the only way to get answers to homework problems was to wrestle with them. And we didn't actually care, of course, about the answers. We cared about the wrestling. And so when you saw the answers, you had some reliable evidence that wrestling took place and consequently learning, right? That started to really collapse even before generative AI appeared. There's a provocative paper from Rutgers recently that looked at a set of courses that have online homework and exams, and found that back in 2012, it was usually the case that if you had good online homework scores, you had good exam scores. But there was a small subset of good homework score students with low exam scores, maybe 14% in 2012. By 2018, that had become about 54%. So it had become possible for people to get answers to their homework questions without the wrestling and the learning that was associated with it. So we've spent a lot of time in these courses looking at product and hoping it meant process had taken place. Generative AI has accelerated the process of making product irrelevant to process. And so we need to be looking at process. We need to be seeing people do the things that lead to learning one way and another. And not just asking them, please give us a product at the end of the course. You said, Richard, about writing. It's a process, right? We need to be working on the process. It's not the paper at the end even that is the main point. It's the process they went through to get there.
Yeah. So I taught at UCI. We have these upper level courses of the disciplines that are writing intensive courses, and I taught one of these in sociology last term, and did exactly this. Had them show the process of writing in these small assignments all the way through, and then at the end, including getting feedback and the like, and responding to feedback. And in the end, they turn in the final paper, and the final paper is worth, I don't know, a few points, and all the points are from all the process. You got to put the assessment on the process itself.
Yeah.
And there's a couple of my colleagues here at UCSB, Paul Rogers and Karen Chancellor, have a new book looking at academic source use and academic writing, and they studied expert writers from multiple disciplines. And one of the things they talk a lot about is this idea of scaffolding notes, and they've been thinking about that in the context of AI, and that's exactly what we're talking about here. Is looking at people's scaffolding notes. How is it that, what do people pay attention to? How do they put the things they pay attention to together to form a picture? Because that's exactly what expertise is. Experts are able to take pieces of a puzzle and assemble it into something that is coherent.
Yeah, it's also interesting or ironic that the AI tools themselves have embraced this idea. By now you put in a prompt and it does a think aloud for you, like like we've measured with our scientist or expertise. So, oh, now I'm going to look at this and
Get
that.
things
Now I'm
done
going to
right.
put it, try this. Oh no, it didn't work. I'm going to try something else. And whether or not those things are at all aligned with what it's actually doing, I'm skeptical, but it's doing this performance that we can it aligns with kind of how we've thought about this cognitive process.
So as we kind of near the end of this part of our session, we've talked a lot about course level assessment, but I'd like for us to step back at the end to think a little bit more broadly. Being sociologists here in the room, Richard and I like to think about beyond the course, right? Institutional level. So what would it look like to rethink assessment, not at the course level, but really at the program level, or maybe even higher than that? Can we grapple with that for a bit?
Oh, this is one of my favorite things to grapple with. And Richard and I have been doing some work grappling with this within the UC system. Learning cannot just occur at the level of a course. Learning occurs as people transfer knowledge from one course to another. And as our friend Mike Dennon would ask, why is it then that we place such a burden on course level assessments instead of shifting assessment to the level of the program? So what would it look like to build a series of courses where we might do some medium to high stakes learning at different points in that process, and then have a very high stakes assessment at the end of a program? What would it mean? And this is, again, echoing a point that Mike makes, but that other folks have made as well, when individual faculty can shift from being coaches and judges to coaches as students work through that process. And then the judging is done collectively by a group of faculty working together. This is, again, a model that within composition is relatively common, but outside of composition is almost never done.
Yeah, I think that freeing people from the idea that they're doing something quite summative at the course level is part of the future. We need to get there somehow. It is so much more attractive to be an instructor whose job is to coach students toward the very best that they can accomplish in your course. And I tell my students every semester that that's what I'm doing. And then I give them an exam, and a bunch of them don't do well on it. And they tell me that I lied to them because I'm doing both, right? The coaches we have here at the University of Michigan sometimes are very successful in their athletic endeavors. And they do so in part because they really can tell the team that they're on their side. We win and lose together, not separately. And because the trial is someone else's, they don't place it on the students. So I think the more we can think about effective schemes for doing that, the better the course environment will be for everyone. I do have questions about what the very high stakes final part of this is. In some sense, the roll up of an enormous amount of effort and feedback ought to lead to great confidence in what's going to happen in that final stage. But I think this kind of two-track approach, boy, it could really help us to break the system, and that would be really, really nice. Maybe we've even already done it. I mean, a reality of our institution, and I know many others, is that a very large fraction of courses have already moved to a form of grading, let's just say the grading part, whatever the assessment is, the grading part where almost everyone is receiving almost the same grade. They've already done this. They've already said we're not really participating in a Rankine grading system. And we still average all that in with the handful of people who think they are still doing a Rankine grading system, which is even crazier. So anything we could do to break it would be a good thing.
I'm also for course level, I think it'd be great if you kind of just assess process, engagement, time on task. That's really close to what the learning in a course would look like. The advantages of doing this more formal assessment of programs, it also has the advantage that the public is, not just us, but the public is questioning what are students actually doing themselves? What can they do? And so the program level assessment at the end would kind of answer that and ensure the legitimacy of what we're providing to students in terms of development and growth in college. And so I think would have that advantage as well.
Well, thank you. I appreciate all your great insights. I'm going to turn it over to Michael to get some questions from the audience.
Yes. Well, first of all, let's thank our panelists. I mean, we can think of raucous applause for everyone. It's hard to do on Zoom, but just the panelists should imagine a room full of lots of clapping. So there's not been a lot of questions in the chat yet, but I do want to acknowledge that one of them was about learning outcomes, and I think people had already touched on that and provided an answer. So if the person who asked that wants more, please feel free to raise your hand about the learning outcome direction. There was a lot of questions and comments about this last question, how we might go, to this more program level assessment, and things like that. I do want to use my prerogative here to ask a question that you all triggered that I hadn't really thought of, while everyone else can think of their questions, raise hands and put in the chat. But be really quick with this answer so that we can go. My sense is it's sort of an institutional change one. I feel like our colleagues just don't trust our students to do the work to learn, that they feel like our students don't care about learning. And I know, Richard, you study this a lot, and I'm sure Tim and Linda, you think about it and study it. Just real quickly, how do we convince our colleagues that students actually want to learn? Because I think they do. Like, I'm shocked when people say, and Richard, you said hanging out with economists, like if we changed the assessment so it was clear the learning mattered, that's what they're paying for. So why wouldn't they do it? Like, it would be dumb to pay us all this money and then not do the work. As someone put it in the chat, I pay my trainer. I do the work. I don't send someone else to my trainer.
Yeah.
I would, so I'm gonna say two things here to Michael. So I think I 100% I agree that it's the wrong frame to think about our students, that they're just here to kind of cheat and kind of and we're going to need to police them and so on. That's the wrong approach. But I also respect our colleagues' judgment that they're observing something that's real, and that is that the students aren't particularly, many students aren't particularly focused on their own learning and development and growth. And so I think you have to take that last piece and struggle with it head on and say, what is it about what we've been providing them that isn't working to engage them, their natural interest, and their own incentives to develop and grow in college? What is it about what we're providing that's missing the mark? What can we do different so we design a way for this real problem that when we look on campus at our students, there are a set of them that aren't fully focused on, fully engaged. And so I think we can use it as a diagnostic tool about what we're delivering ourselves, but certainly the answer isn't let's police them more thoroughly. That's not the business any of us want to be in or got involved as educators to do.
I'm dying to jump in, so I'm doing it. So I want to build on what Richard has said. So three things. The way I think about the question or what the response that Richard's just given is turn judgment to curiosity. And so often we, as researchers, we're trained to critique. And we were chatting before this started, not always to think about, like, how do we solve this thing that we are seeing? So turn judgment into curiosity. We're researchers. What are the things we ask? We ask, we're observing this thing, just as Richard said. That's curious. why are we eliciting this thing? And I had a conversation, the same conversation with a faculty colleague here who said, when other people teach this one class, they say nobody comes, but I taught it differently and everybody came and they kept coming because I designed for people to be engaged. So there's that. The tendency to judge students, Michael and I have had this conversation many times, makes me absolutely crazy, like makes my hair start on fire. Why is it that we tend to run toward, those darn students and shake our fist like the late middle-aged people, as I like to think of myself, that some of us are? Why, what feeds into that tendency and turn judgment into curiosity for ourselves? And then again, what do we want, not what do we not want? And so often we design for what we don't want rather than thinking, what do we want? Those are all answers to the same question.
Yeah. I mean, I think this comes around to Richard's conversation about incentives as well, of course. We did a fascinating study here recently for our business school, which had a long-standing tradition of explicit curved grading in all of their courses. Right? And we did a qualitative study where we spoke to many students about the way this affects their approach to their classes. They know that the entire reward for this system comes for ending up at the top of that pile. And of course, you can end up at the top of that pile by climbing to the top or by pushing other people down. And they do both. And there were very anguished stories from students about how they could never work with or become friends with the students in their own course because they're in direct competition with them. So they would meet someone in another section of the same course to work with and collaborate with. Some of them admitted to misleading one another in that environment. So when we create environments that have genuine high stakes for students, in the business school case, it's, do you get an interview with the firm that you want? Students will pursue that goal, even if they loved learning. They need that thing. And it drives them to really dreadful outcomes that they regret deeply. So by the way, our business school has given up that practice as a result of this study.
So I think we've actually covered the few questions in the chat. So, good, Bridget, you raised yours. I was going to say people should raise their hand. Bridget, go ahead.
Yeah, and I did, and I this has just been enriching and also validating. And actually, something came up 2 hours ago because we're in the middle of accommodated testing. But I wanted to ask you all, what is your response? Because I know my response, but I would like to know your response when you are working with units, colleges, departments, et cetera, that do like to have quotas of A, B, C, et cetera, for that sorting purpose. I would just love to know if you have a response to that one.
I have a response because we see that, especially in some of our pathway sequences. And my response, honestly, is A, to look at who is where in that curve, in that explicit curve that is in that course, and whether that is what we want to see. And B, to simply flat out say, and maybe people can say I'm wrong for doing this, that's just inequitable. Why are you doing that? Mm-hmm. And sometimes it's in a straightforward way as that, and sometimes in a nicer way. Because I really cannot see any rationale. I mean, I know why they're doing it, but I think to just say, I understand this, and yes, there are some structural reasons why we need to think about the things that you're thinking about, but really, is that the message that we want to send to students during their first, second, third quarter in college, especially the students who are winding up on that curve where they are? To me, that is not a message I want to send. And to some of them, it's not the message we want to send. And then the conversation becomes, what do we do differently? And I think the study that Tim has just cited is a really good illustration of thinking about the intended and maybe unintended consequences, or maybe known but not attended to consequences. I mean, maybe Richard, others have different responses.
Richard mentioned at the beginning the fact that especially in these early courses, when students are the most diverse. They come from very diverse backgrounds, right? After they've been with us for several years, they have some chance of being a little regularized, but at the beginning, they're very, very diverse. So the actual ranked outcomes in these introductory courses are often almost entirely reflective of what they've done before. And since we are operating a system that has high stakes, students play to that. We have students who've taken 2 years of college math and then take first year calculus, knowing that they're going to get the top grade in the class, because that top grade in the class is a part of the reward system that we've built. And they want that more than they want to learn some new math, right? So if people are doing this kind of ranking, we really need to very critically challenge what they're doing, because they think they're doing something that relates to student either success or knowledge, and they're not. And we can't let them continue to assert that they are.
And can I just add one more thing? When we design, I mean, I am in a role here where, we work a lot on sort of looking at data, thinking about institutional change, student success, faculty success, and support. And we do design a lot of initiatives and innovations to work with students and support students in those situations. And every time we do that, and they are, they do tend to be, they tend to work in that students tend to see better outcomes. But every time we do that, I know that we're to some extent enabling this system. And so, as people who work inside a university, all of us have to balance these roles. How do we support the students as they undergo this really inequitable, clearly inequitable situation, and try to change it at the same time?
Linda, I think that's a great place to wrap up. First of all, thank everyone who put all the wonderful comments in the chat. There was a lot of good feedback, comments, support in the chat. Thank the panelists. This was, I think, an excellent conversation and a really good look forward. I think I can speak for Archie, and if I say it wrong, Archie will no doubt jump in and correct me. This, I think, just affirms what Archie and I suspected. The institutional change work here is critical. And I think it's actually what's emerging is somewhat simple to articulate, which is our reward system and structure drive students to want to get grades and forget about their learning, if I will stereotype at a high level, too much, right? Not everywhere, but too much. And we have to rethink the structures, some at the course level, as people have talked about, and some at the institutional level, so that we can actually free up our students to embrace their natural tendency, which is to want to learn and be excited. And I think at the end of the day, they sort of know, but don't really process that if they don't do the learning, they don't keep the job they get. Like our system is designed, as Tim said, to get them that first interview, right? Because they have the degree from us or they were ranked highest by us. But if they didn't actually learn anything, companies catch on pretty quickly. And so we're actually doing our students a huge disservice when we don't lean into their learning. So more to come on this. Someone very nicely put in the chat that UERU is the place to center this change, Archie, I saw. So we will continue to move this process forward. I don't know, Julia, Steve, if there's any last words that are needed, or if we just applaud again raucously and call it a day.
I think we should applaud again raucously and call it a day. You said it all, Michael. Thank you, everyone, and we will send out the recording very soon.